Let's talk about Squarespace. That's right, we have a sponsor now, and that sponsor is Squarespace. And right now, Squarespace is partnering with TYT, our parent network, and they are gonna be offering up a 10% discount of your first trial. Squarespace is an awesome website where you can design your very own personalized websites for whatever you're working on in your life. I have some personal experience with the website. That is, my girlfriend, I guess now fiance, has a blog that she documents our own travels, our life together, and it's called Have Dog Will Drive. It's wonderful, and she created it with the help of Squarespace. Before this sponsorship even occurred, she just knew that it was the place to go to create a website that was simple and user-friendly and has gotten her some readers from all over the world. So check out her blog, Have Dog Will Drive, and also head over to squarespace.com/TYT for that 10% discount. I can't wait to see what you guys are working on. Welcome to this final part of Murder with Friends. Today's episode is all about the myth and the legend and the truth of HH Holmes. I'm joined again by Alonso and Dave. Now in this third part, we're gonna talk a little bit about his confession, but before he can confess, he has to be apprehended. And he is apprehended on November 17th, 1894 for horse theft, an outstanding warrant for horse theft, which I think just paints a picture in my mind because you have the World's Fair going on and automobiles where you could see them on the street, but horses were still the main method of transportation. So that's really what did him in. And it's pretty easy once he is apprehended to figure out the holes in his story and just all the scams that he's been up to. One, because he's not shy and he does talk a lot. And also because people are just able to connect the dots, especially when it comes to the arson of his hotel in 1893, that insurance companies were looking for this guy. They were really trying to sue him. They wanted to get their money. Finally, he's apprehended for horse theft. Then they're investigating the building, and then all this stuff starts to come up.
For all of his interest in pulling these insurance scams, insurance companies very often denied payment and were not fooled by his chicanery. So yeah, I'm sure once he was actually apprehended, became very easy to create this paper trail of oh, you're this guy. Oh, and you're also this guy. Oh, and you did this, and you tried to pull this, and you tried to claim this, and so yeah, I'm sure that the horse thief angle was just sort of the beginning of the deluge of accusations.
Because it could tie him to Robert Peitzel as well, who, remember in part 2 we talked about how they had this idea that they would prop Peitzel up as this inventor, and then he would fake his death, and then they would collect the money, but really Holmes was just setting him up to kill him and collect the money. But it was a pretty obvious murder scene. Peitzel was chloroformed and then burnt.
Yes, although they chloroformed him after burning him to make it look like a suicide. It's very bizarre.
That's very weird that, can you kill yourself with chloroform, or was the idea that he would chloroform himself and then burn it?
I don't even know how you chloroform somebody who's already dead, because I think you had to inhale. So I found that part a little baffling, but yeah, I'm sure people who've studied this more deeply will.
Well, Adam Seltzer wrote a really good book about breaking down what we often think about when we think of HH Holmes, and he sort of postulates that it's likely that if Holmes was killing people, he was probably using poison. He doesn't feel like this was a very violent guy, a guy that really had a bloodlust. I think that when you look at his victimology and the number of people who disappeared that he was close to or had romantic relationships with, outside of the young children, I can't really say anything about that. I think these may have been personally motivated as well as opportunistic.
Sure, just getting them out of the way.
Yeah, and there's a passion in that as well, where it's like, I have to kill you. I don't think he was this as purely, I'm just gonna poison you because it is the compassionate way to kill you. But that is what Adam says, and I think he's done his research, so it's very possible. 1895, he's put on trial for the murder of Peitzel, and he was convicted, but not based off of there was no evidence found in the murder castle that was used to convict him. Although while he was behind bars or while he was in custody, he started just talking and confessing to killing. He confessed to killing 27 people. Now, of course, you'll probably hear that number as skywards of 200. Some people have said 1,000. Again, he was probably only guilty of killing 9 people because 3 or 4 of the people that he confessed to killing of the 27 were living.
Still alive.
Were still alive.
Right.
So I don't know how you really explain that. Let's talk a little bit about his confession, but first I have an excerpt from one of his supposed confessions, so let's take a look at that.
The Inquirer, the New York Journal, and the Philadelphia North American all published confessions from Holmes in 1896. Notably, each confession varies slightly depending on the publication. The Philadelphia North American printed in part, "Yes, I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer no more than the poet can help the inspiration to song, nor the ambition of an intellectual man to be great. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I ushered into the world, and he has been with me since. Not only that, I was not satisfied in taking it in the ordinary way. I sought devices strange, fantastical, and even grotesque. It pleased my fancy. It gave me play to work my murderous will, and I revealed in it with the enthusiasm of an alchemist who is hot on the trail of the philosopher's stone."
So.
That quote sounds like the confession of a Scooby-Doo criminal.
And I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
I suspect that, weirdly enough, we talked about how the exposition is sort of, represents the peak of the American Industrial Revolution. There is something about the whole murder castle mythos that's almost like the Henry Fordization of serial killing, where he has the chutes and he has the crematorium and it's all very organized and it's like an assembly line basically. Right. Like this is a murder factory. And again, I think, and we'll talk about this more as we go along, but I think that so much of what we talk about when we talk about Holmes, he becomes more of a metaphor for the age in which he lived in a lot of ways than necessarily a person who actually did a lot of the things that he claimed to have done or that other people claimed that he did. Yeah,
and just from a reader standpoint, you can read Holmes's confession, the number of confessions that have printed, and it is, I will say, it is really tricky to find credible sources out there because so much of it was picked up that wasn't true, and the dates of which the lies begin is so soon that it gets really confusing because you'll find something printed in 1898 that is just not correct. But what you can tell from what Holmes is writing is that he has this weird syntax and way of speaking and writing that is very long form and very roundabout. So the quick confessional sound bites that are often shared, it's more often than not they're not true, but there's a kernel of truth in there in the sense that at some point in time he wrote that he felt that while he was behind bars in prison awaiting his sentencing or trial or whatever, that he started to look like the devil. But he didn't even just say that in a sentence. Adam Seltzer says in his book that it took him about 9 paragraphs to get to saying that, that hot button quote that people like to share.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody at the Philadelphia Inquirer or the New York Journal or one of those papers wrote that paragraph and was like, you good with this? And like had him sign off on it. And that is to this day a fairly common practice where a lot of times if a famous person is writing the foreword to a book or something, someone else will write it, will write a draft, and that person will go through and maybe make some changes rather than sit down and compose a thing, him or herself. And so yeah, that kind of purple prose is very reminiscent of the way a crime reporter would talk about things. The devil was at my bed as my sponsor, Oh yeah. I'm sure that somebody on the Hearst payroll wrote that and said, just handed it over and got a signature from Mr. Holmes.
Dave, what do you make of this confession?
I think when you're building myths, it helps to keep, piling it on. And wherever that quote came from is part of this myth building. And what Alonso was mentioning earlier is this entire situation, came out of a moment in American history where the world was rapidly changing and shifting. The ground was moving under everyone's feet. There was, and the Chicago, the World's Fair there was sort of emblematic of this. It was, the generation that fought the Civil War, they were old. And the next generation had come along and all these new technological developments and electricity and the motion picture and, things like that. And it served to bring a good chunk of the American population to Chicago for this moment. A Chicago that had an image problem and has continued, throughout the 20th century to have one, as a sort of corrupt place, and it was a lot of people's first time in a big city, and
in an era where people were leaving the farms and moving to the cities,
right?
Because that's where the work was.
And you've got so you go to that World's Fair, you leave, you come home, you hear about this murder trial, it becomes the trial of the moment, and you think, well, that's what I always knew about the city. I always knew it was an evil place where terrible, dastardly, diabolical, satanic things happen. And I'm so happy that I'm back in my little place.
The last time we were here, we talked about Ed Gein, and I think he's sort of the reverse of that, where, country people put their fear of the city into HH Holmes, city people put their fear of the country into Ed Gein. Like, if we go off the main road, if we stray too far out into the woods, into the sticks, we're gonna meet, the Leatherface family. So, Charles Manson becomes the manifestation of the 60s and the hippies and all the things that the establishment was afraid of and distrusted. I think certain murders become, like I said, metaphors for more broad-based anxieties in society.
Yeah, so we latch on to, as the culture is shifting, we latch on to this sensational thing, and the myth just continues to build. And anybody who wants to add to it can add to it pretty confidently that it will stick, and that game of telephone will just keep getting played.
Yeah.
And so this whole, particularly when it involves a murder, because I think serial killers in particular. I mean, we were discussing this over breakfast this morning. What's the difference between a serial killer and just someone who kills a lot of people? Well, a mass murderer is not exactly the same. That's the guy in Las Vegas who shoots 50 people. But a serial killer has, a story and a drama and a
motive.
A motive, and what, no matter how personal and weird and fractured inside their mind that motive might be, they have an idea about themselves as the star of this situation. And serial killers in particular fascinate us because they are so organized that we will place ourselves as just regular folks with normal understandings of life and death, perhaps. Well, normal, who knows? But we will place ourselves in that situation, and it feeds our anxiety about survival. Could I survive in the murder castle? What if that happened to me? How would I get out? And so we love that thing because we're so anxious about it ourselves. We're anxious about the things that exist in a place like a murder castle in a big city that we've never been to before. We're attracted to it.
And there's also a level of, again, that anxiety about the World's Fair because very close to the end of it, the mayor of Chicago was assassinated at the Columbian Exposition. In fact, instead of a closing ceremony, they held a memorial for him. So that event was already sort of tainted with this kind of with blood, literally, with this association with murder and crime and degradation. So to have this guy as sort of an adjunct to it, just kind of, it feeds into the overall narrative like, oh, the city and bad place.
And I think also for all the facts that you can find, there is still enough mystery that you want to paint your own story on top of it. So there were disappearances. There's still people who we don't exactly know what happened to them that did pass through Holmes's establishment. We have no idea what happened to these people. And instead of that becoming the story and just sort of figuring out what we can do there and probably not coming to a satisfying conclusion, you can just say, oh, they probably went down this chute, but before that they were in this vault where no one could hear them scream, and then they were put into this vat of acid, and then now they're somewhere in a medical school. And I think that is sort of easier and more fantastical, and the bad stuff is always easier to believe than just he probably disposed of these bodies in cement somewhere and we'll never know.
As you know, our actual job, we're film critics. And so this idea of the fantastical way of killing and dying, has spread throughout popular culture. We wouldn't have films like Hostel or Saw or
Human Centipede.
Human Centipede, any number of these kind of films, if it weren't for the fascination of people, the imagination of dying in a
human abattoir.
A bizarre, fantastical way.
Yeah, so Holmes is hung May 7th, 1896, but his story lives on and the lore lives on. The castle would burn in August 1895, and a lot of places you will hear that the castle burned down, but that's not the case. It actually still existed until 1938 when it was finally torn down, and now in its place is a post office. And you can just look that up online. There's a beautiful photo of the post office that just exists there.
And on the History Channel show, which is my favorite of the speculative wildness, the grandson goes into the basement, and there's ghosts.
Well, duh.
Yeah.
They're obviously ghosts.
Obviously ghosts. There's a postal employee. He goes down there. I don't like to go in that basement anymore, says the postal employee. Ghosts. And so it's funny to me that we will do anything to make this more real than perhaps it was.
And it's going to be really interesting to see how it's treated when it gets the big screen version, and Leonardo DiCaprio will be playing HH Holmes. But that was our episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know it probably wasn't what you were expecting to hear about the murder castle and HH Holmes, but I would be really curious to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Have you read Eric Larson's book? Have you read Adam Seltzer's? What research have you done? Why was this the most requested killer? Why? But also, hi. Bye. Thanks for watching Murder with Friends. We love you. See you next time.